Chapter 2. Fight for Survival. Kazutora couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Hanma had changed something inside him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't consumed by despair. It was strange, almost unsettling. Hanma's words lingered in his mind, replaying over and over. Maybe there was a way out. Maybe this wasn't the end. But as the days passed, Hanma seemed to disappear. Kazutora looked for him at school, even at the spots they had started hanging out at. But Hanma was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. Kazutora found himself sinking back into the darkness. Without Hanma around, the weight of his life began to crush him again. His father's cold words, his mother's expectations, they all felt unbearable. And school was no better. Kazutora had always been the quiet kid, the one who kept his head down and tried not to draw attention. But that didn't stop the bullies. There were always a few guys in his class who found pleasure in making his life miserable. They'd push him around in the hallways, knock his books out of his hands, and call him names. He hated it, but he didn't know how to fight back. He was weak, both physically and emotionally, and he knew it. All he could do was endure it, hoping that one day it would stop. But it never. It was a Friday afternoon when everything came to a head. Kazutora had just finished another grueling day at school, his body sore from the latest round of bullying. He was heading home, his steps slow and weary, when he heard the familiar sound of fists hitting flesh. It was coming from an alleyway just a few blocks from the school. Curiosity got the better of him, and he cautiously approached the noise. As he rounded the corner, his heart stopped. There, in the middle of the alley, was Hanma. But he didn't look like the confident cold guy Kazutora had met on the bridge. He was battered, bloodied, and struggling to stay on his feet. Two guys, both older and much larger, were circling him like wolves. "Come on, Hanma," one of them sneered. "You thought you could take both of us? You're out of your mind." Hanma wiped blood from his mouth and smirked, though it was clear he was in pain. "I've taken worse than you two," he muttered. But his bravado didn't hide the fact that he was losing. His movements were sluggish, and Kazutora could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Kazutora's mind raced. Hanma had saved him, pulled him back from the brink, and now he was about to get beaten to a pulp. He couldn't just stand there and do nothing. But what could he do? He didn't know how to fight, didn't know how to protect himself, let alone someone else. But then he remembered Hanma's words about finding a way out, about fighting back. Kazutora clenched his fists. He was terrified, but he couldn't let fear control him anymore. Not this time. Without thinking, he ran forward. "Hey, leave him alone," he shouted, his voice trembling but determined. The two guys turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden intrusion. They sneered when they saw who it was. A scrawny, scared-looking kid with no idea what he was getting into. "And who the hell are you?" one of them scoffed. Kazutora didn't answer. He just charged forward, throwing himself at the nearest guy with all the strength he could muster. It wasn't much, and his punch was sloppy, but it connected. The guy staggered back, more out of shock than anything else. "Damn it, Kazutora," Hanma muttered, though there was a hint of a grin on his face. "You're a real idiot, you know that?" But Kazutora didn't care. He just kept swinging, kept fighting, even as the other guy grabbed him and threw him to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to get back up. He wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. Hanma, seeing Kazutora's determination, found a renewed burst of energy. He pushed through the pain, landing a solid punch on the guy who had been taunting him. The alley was filled with the sounds of grunts and shouts, but slowly the tide began to turn. Kazutora and Hanma fought side by side, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated, but there was a fire in their eyes that couldn't be extinguished. Eventually, the two attackers realized they were outmatched, not by skill, but by sheer willpower. They exchanged glances, cursed under their breaths, and finally fled the scene, leaving Kazutora and Hanma standing victorious. Kazutora collapsed against the alley wall, panting heavily. His whole body ached, and he could feel blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. But despite the pain, there was a strange sense of satisfaction blooming in his chest. He had fought back. He had stood up for himself and for Hanma. Hanma, equally exhausted, slumped down next to him. He looked over at Kazutora, his usual smirk replaced by something softer, something almost resembling pride. "Not bad, Kazutora," he said, his voice hoarse. "Didn't think you had it in you." Kazutora managed a weak smile. "I didn't either." They sat in silence for a while, both of them too tired to move. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind only pain and exhaustion. But there was also a bond, a connection that hadn't been there before. They had fought together, and that meant something. Finally, Hanma broke the silence. "You know, you didn't have to do that. You could have just walked away." Kazutora shook his head. "I couldn't. You saved me. I couldn't just let you." Hanma chuckled softly. "Yeah, well, don't make a habit of it. I don't need saving." Kazutora didn't believe that for a second, but he didn't argue. Instead, he looked up at the darkening sky, feeling a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had control over something, like he wasn't just drifting through life. He glanced over at Hanma, who was staring off into the distance, lost in thought. Despite his tough exterior, Kazutora knew there was more to him, something deeper, something worth fighting for. And maybe, just maybe, they could figure it out together. "Let's go," Hanma finally said, pulling himself to his feet. "We've got to patch ourselves up before we run into more trouble." Kazutora nodded and followed him out of the alley. As they walked side by side, bruised and battered but not broken, Kazutora couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. There was still so much more to come. Challenges, fights, and maybe even more moments of doubt. But with Hanma by his side, he felt like he could face it all. Little did he know, this was only the start of a journey that would change both of their lives forever.